Hello everybody, Julian Charles here of themindrenewed.com, coming to you from the depths of the Lancashire countryside here in the UK. And welcome back to TMR after our extended break over half-term. Certainly a little bit longer than I had hoped, but that's just the way things go sometimes with all the busyness of life, which I'm quite sure the vast majority of listeners are all too familiar with. However, it's good to be back again, and so joining us today all the way from Nashville, I'm delighted to welcome to the programme John J. Thompson, author of the both charming and challenging book Jesus, Bread and Chocolate, published by Zondervan. John is an almost 30-year music industry veteran, an author, songwriter, artist, producer and teacher, currently serving as a creative director at Capital CMG Publishing and the leader of a small group ministry at his own home in Nashville, which I'll be very interested to ask about in a minute, actually. He has a passion for several interconnected things, such as authentic, spiritually alive art, transformative community, innovative business practices, artisanal living, and even home-roasted coffee and home-brewed beer, all of which are explored in this insightful book of his, which we're going to be discussing here today. So, John, welcome to the program. It really is great to have you on.
I'm honored to be here. Really excited to talk to you.
Well, it's great to be speaking with you because, as I said to you before the interview, I really did enjoy reading your book. I found it genuinely a pleasure to read because so much of what you had to say about authentic Christianity and the ways in which that tends to get obscured in modern life in one way or another very much connects with some of my own thoughts on this, and no doubt will connect with the thoughts of many people who listen to the programme. But I also found it challenging. How can we recover that authenticity in a way that speaks to people who are so often put off by the way Christians actually do things? So I do thank you for writing it. I did enjoy it, and obviously I do recommend that book to listeners to go get a copy and read it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I don't know whether you'll agree, but I'm going to say read it slowly. Take time to read it with a decent cup of coffee, perhaps with a Bible to hand, because I do think it is a well-crafted book, and I think it promotes a kind of meditative attitude towards it, to meditate on some of those deep issues that you discuss. Anyway, perhaps, John, we could start with your motivation for writing this book and a bit more information about you yourself. Now, in a sense, this book is very autobiographical in structure, so we'll get into more detail about your life as we go along. But could you give us a very brief sketch of your background and the journey towards writing this book?
Sure. I'll give my cousin Kenan credit because she's one of the people who really challenged me and kind of pushed me into taking frequent rants and conversations and soliloquies as we hung out in California. And she said, you have to write this down. I've been doing ministry of one sort or another really since I was a teenager. I think by the time I entered the 9th grade, the youth leaders asked me to help them with the 8th graders. And it's something that I've always been very passionate about communicating, especially deep and important ideas that are hard to grasp. And I have really come to value taking a slower approach to that as opposed to the 5 points and an altar call kind of model. I found that anytime I could create some sort of conversation around something, I could find ways of connecting that to important underlying ideas. I would challenge myself in that process, and the relationships, the people that were around me tended to challenge it as well, and I challenged them. And for the last 10 years, 15 years, I've been deeply committed to the importance of small group ministry, and a lot of these conversations are also ones that happened over a pint of beer, a cup of coffee in my home, and I realized how pervasive the problem of the over-commodification of the gospel is. I saw it happening in the lives of longtime Christians who were becoming fatigued, sort of burnt out on the church and the sort of manufactured nature of everything. And I saw it amongst a whole lot of young folks, my kids' age, in their early 20s, who were starting to identify more as spiritual but not religious and kind of detaching from the church without necessarily propositionally rejecting any of the doctrinal points of the gospel. They were just culturally, aesthetically, and I think spiritually disconnecting from the body, and it was troubling to me in very deep ways. And so a lot of these conversations came from a desire on my part to find authenticity for myself and my own family and my own spiritual journey, and then realizing that the same things I was hungry for were the things that a lot of other people around me were hungry for. And so it made sense to articulate it. And I guess, I've been a songwriter, I've been a writer, I've been a storyteller for a while. So this is just sort of my comfort language. This is how I process these things. That would be the more recent motivation. In terms of a just kind of sketch of my life, I had a pretty troubled childhood. My mother came to faith during the tail end of the Jesus movement, which I know you've talked about on your program before. So I grew up with a certain level of fear and terror in my home, as well as quite a bit of Jesus music and charismatic worship, but also in the Anglican Church and growing up with that. So it was a strange kind of confluence of influences in my life. And I turned to music at a pretty young age as a sort of lifeline. I've been passionate about it ever since and discovered a whole world eventually of faith-driven, alternative and marginal music that I really identified with, and I built an entire life on that. And I started a business when I was a kid that was a music store and a concert venue and a magazine called True Tunes. I ended up working for a big festival called the Cornerstone Festival, which is where I really discovered a lot of this stuff in the first place when I was about 13. Worked for them for a few years. And then was recruited once my wife and I had decided to move to Nashville, which really was for more ministry purposes. But once we made the decision, Eddie DeGarmo from Capital CMG Publishing, which was then called EMI CMG Publishing, Eddie recruited me to join his team in the publishing company here, which is where I am now. So that's a real lightning round overview. Yeah, that's kind of the gist of it.
Yeah. Well, that's good, because there are loads of things in there that I want to ask you more about as we go along. And actually, before we leave your home base, as it were, you mentioned about this ministry at home. Is this actually in the place where you actually live? Do you actually have church in your own home?
Well, we attend at a local church, and so on Sunday mornings, and we do special events with them, and we're very involved. Michelle and I, my wife and I, lead worship there from time to time, and I've even been a guest preacher when the pastor goes away for something. So we're very connected to a local church, which we enjoy. And in Chicago, before we moved here, I was actually the pastor of a small church called the Warehouse Church in Aurora, Illinois, and from the time I was 18 until I was 37, that was home. And I went from being the youth pastor to worship leader to one of the pastors there, served there for over a decade before we moved, and still remain very connected to that church community. And
what sort of numbers would we be talking about in terms of membership there?
Oh, I think on a good Sunday, 150 people. It's a pretty small inner city community. And that church was really the product of a small group of people who felt called to reach out to folks who were marginalized by most of the other churches in the city. And in fact, the church started because pastors from several other churches of various denominations supported it and encouraged it. It was truly a special thing to behold. Even amongst the elders, we had differing views on things like eternal security and eschatology and all kinds. We would actually disagree as pastors on some of those things, but we felt completely united in the call to love the city, to be Jesus to hurting people.
Yeah, that's fantastic, isn't it? Because so often the caricature is presented as all these denominations, they all disagree with each other. Why can't Christians get on? And what you've just said there is exactly the opposite of that. We can be different and yet still get on.
Yeah, and I think our church, which was called the Warehouse, was instrumental, and still to this day is a gathering place for pastors from all different churches in the city. And Randy Schoaf, who's one of my best friends, and he's the full-time pastor there. He hates it if you call him the lead pastor or the head pastor, because he hates that. But he's the full-time pastor, and his passion is for creating that kind of unity. And that was hugely influential over my whole life, and still is. Right. So when in Nashville, we're connected to a church, but from day one, we knew we were coming to open our home and see who God brought in. We decided to move into East Nashville, which, especially at the time, was where the lower middle class, aspiring artists, very creative community could afford to live. And we decided that we were just going to go. We had an idea of who we thought. We had a lot of friends in Nashville. I've been working in the music business my whole life, so I figured I had 10 or 15 people I thought would come. None of them have ever come. But an entire different crop of people showed up, and it actually has been our primary focus and priority outside of our own family has been cultivating, mentoring, and being influenced and taught by this small group that actually does, yes, meet in our home. And yes, we have worship times, we have prayer, we have Bible studies, we go through studies and discussions, we have lots of fun. We have house concerts and all kinds of stuff. And there's sort of concentric circles. There's kind of an inner circle of a handful of people that are really part of the bullseye. But then there's a slightly bigger outer circle that are people that have been a part of it at times. Maybe they don't come every week or every time we do something. And then there's a larger circle that are people from the community that come for special events, parties, concerts, that kind of thing. And that feels very natural and organic too. Some people move through that cone, as it were, down into the center, and some people just interact with us on the periphery. But that kind of ministry is really why we moved to Nashville. It's really how we're driven, and that's the kind of mentality that all of these conversations in the book sort of flow from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I very much connect with that kind of vision for ministry, because no doubt listeners to this podcast will be absolutely fed up with me mentioning the guy's name, but a guy who had a great deal of influence upon me many, many years ago, Brian Austin, ran Christian Bookshop in London, and he did church from that bookshop, and a fellowship grew around that. So I can very much connect with that kind of vision. I think it's fantastic. Now, in your book, you rather intriguingly open it with a notion called twang, as you call it. And that serves as a kind of metaphor for much of what you then discuss throughout the rest of the book. And I thought it was a great idea, because as I was reading it, I kept thinking of that twang, twang, twang. It sort of linked everything together in my mind. So could you describe what twang is, and, how did you first get hold of that notion at all?
This is pretty funny. I'll just be totally honest. The book was almost done. I had been working on it. I'd been editing it. I'd had all the sections, the chocolate section and the coffee section. I had everything done, but I was really wrestling with how to start the conversation. And I was very fortunate to have good editorial involvement from Zondervan. And one person involved really felt like I needed to lead with the very dramatic story of my childhood, and there was a particular the sentence that leads that discussion off about my biological father. He felt that's the first line, and it's all true. And I mean, I'm happy that I wrote that, and that I've shared that part of my story many times in my life now. But I didn't really see this book being terribly autobiographical when I first started writing it. I didn't actually even notice the sort of thread of memoir, as we're calling it, until it was almost done, and I realized how personal a lot of this was. So my editors really challenged me to get more and more personal, and that created one line of kind of a sinew that connected a lot of these ideas. But then really at the 11th hour, I remembered this conversation I had with Buddy Miller, who's a songwriter, artist, producer, who's one of my absolute favorite artists and a huge influence on me from a long time ago, 20 years ago or so. And I remembered him, I was sharing this story in a totally different context with a friend about twang, and then it just occurred to me that was the missing key to tie all these ideas, that I could take that term and apply it to all of these things.
Absolutely.
And there's a last minute thing.
It really works well. So you're going to have to explain what twang is.
Sure. I used it as a pejorative term. As a young songwriter and artist, when I go back and listen to a lot of my songs, there's a lot of what people would call twanginess in it. It's sort of those bent notes, the bam, bam. It's when two notes that are not quite in the same chord. One of them is bending and trying to get up into the proper chord, and that's really the twang. And so
it's not the same as blues notes then.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think that blues notes are part of that twang, as well as a lot of stuff that happens in gospel and jazz and a lot of country music.
Right.
And I can only approach it with any kind of integrity from a Western perspective. I mean, I've listened to Eastern music and I know a little bit about it, but to me, when you listen to Eastern music, it all sounds dissonant and different because we're not used to hearing a lot of those quarter tones. But in Western music, our notes have been blocked off such that we can tell if something is in a major chord, in a minor chord, or if it's in a diminished chord, or if it's in an augmented chord or a suspended chord.
Absolutely.
You think of that chord in Tommy, Pinball Wizard, when you hear the dang it's like there's a note that's in there that's not quite right, but then it resolves, and then it unresolves, and then it resolves, and then it unresolves.
Right.
And that's the nature of rock and roll and gospel and blues. And all that kind of music.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, we have a real difficulty, don't we, with our equal temperament? You know, you see the piano sort of stretched out in front of you, and everything is in these nice equal semitones, and then you know that your blues note is just somewhere in between those, and you just can never get them. The only way you can do it, I suppose, sometimes is by pressing both the kind of the major third and the minor third at the same time to make that sort of
right.
But it's not really authentic.
On a guitar, especially a slide guitar, you know, your options then become a lot more open because you can hit all of those points, whereas a piano locks you in to certain notes. Now, great piano players can certainly play with a heck of a lot of twang, so don't get me wrong. But that was the conversation Buddy Miller and I had at a pancake house, and I was telling him about the music that I love, Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan and James Brown and Stevie Wonder and this stuff. And he was telling me he was just getting ready to do his first solo record. And basically I said, I love country music, I just don't like the twang. And then I used examples of Garth Brooks and Shania Twain, which at the time were the two biggest names in pop country music. And Buddy very graciously, and if you ever get a chance to talk to Buddy, everything he says is very slow and methodical and loving, and he's the epitome of cool. But he says, well, John, he goes, maybe it's not the twang that you don't like about country, but the absence of twang. And that got me leaning in, sitting at the table going, what in the world is he talking about? But then as he explained that the twang is that tension, that it's the sound in bluegrass, that they call it the high lonesome sound. It's the sound of the bent notes of rock and roll and of blues. And he was explaining that the twang is the tension of stuff. I realized, boy, that's actually all I care about half the time in music is the twang.
Right.
But
the rest of it just sets a context for the twang to happen. Yeah.
Exactly. But the music that I was thinking sounded twangy, Garth Brooks or Shania Twain or something like whatever example I used, was actually devoid of any kind of authentic twang. But they would go in, the producers would kind of strip out the real countryness of a lot of country music, and they would make it really appeal to the biggest possible commercial audience. Then they would go in with some little tricks, like a little guitar lick here or a little pedal steel lick here, and they would kind of add a little bit of twang back in just to kind of say, oh yeah, this is country. But it didn't feel authentic.
Right, fake twang, gosh, what a thought. Yeah.
Well, and it's funny, I actually had a friend who, when I first started using computers to make music, I scored a ballet for a friend's dance school, and I was learning about how to compose on a computer and use samples of orchestras and all this stuff. It was really fun. And I found an entire collection of country licks that you could just drag and drop into a song and turn anything into you know, and it was completely fake cookie cutter kind of stuff. And I realized,
yes.
well, you know, the thing that Buddy pointed out was, he said, you know, what bothers a lot of us is when we hear that twang, but it's not authentic to the song. It's not really about searching and longing and tension and loss and fear and all these human experiences. It's somehow added in as a kind of a window dressing. And it was just, I mean, like I say in the book, it was like a light was shining on our little booth, and I felt God saying, pay attention, John. This is what I've been trying to get through to you. So after I'd finished most of the book, I realized a lot of this stuff I was circling, these ideas, whether it was coffee or beer or chocolate or bread or home group or house concerts, it was all about things that when the authentic tension, the craftedness of it gets removed, it goes down easier, but it satisfies less. And so that became a metaphor, a theme that I went back and did quite a bit of revising and brought that back into the story throughout the book, and then ended the book back at the table with Buddy. So it was one of those moments where, you know, you kind of nice. Like, oh, this worked out really well.
Yeah, it really did. And of course, we know we do need to connect that to the spiritual insight that you have with that. And I think that there's one sentence in here that I think really captures that well. Let me just read what you say here. We have created a Jesus made in our own image, a light-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, corporate-friendly, feel-good American guru with absolutely no discernible twang. So what do you mean when you apply that to Jesus?
Well, pretty much what I said. I feel like there's an aesthetic way that we present Jesus, and I think it is in our films and our TV, and it's really, I believe it's kind of corrupted our imaginations. I think there's too many people that when they close their eyes and try to picture Jesus, they picture some Jesus they saw in a Christian movie that's an Italian or an English or a California person. I think also It's about the ideas of the gospel. When I look through the gospels and I see Jesus meeting people in the midst of their struggling and their pain and their fears and identifying with that, both through the incarnation, actually taking on flesh and feeling that pain, as well as in his compassion that he has for the people that he encounters, all of whom are in some kind of pain and tension. The ones who aren't are the ones who have deluded themselves, or the rich young ruler or the Pharisees, but the people who come to him seeking and reaching out to him in their brokenness, he meets them in their brokenness and he doesn't leave them in their brokenness. And that to me is something that if we say that our job is to represent him to the world, then we need to really be careful about how we present ourselves as being all buttoned up, all questions answered, all I's dotted, all T's crossed, and we got it figured out, and it's working for us. So that becomes our sales pitch. Why don't you try the gospel? Because it'll work for you, that's just not what I see.
Yeah. So that would be, the one that I have the biggest question mark at this point in our conversation anyway is the phrase that you have here, corporate friendly. All the rest of it is, the light haired, the blue eyed, that's easy just to say. That's a construct. But what do you mean by the corporate friendly Jesus?
Well, corporate as a word, I kind of use contextually along with industrialized and commodified, that it's not bad in and of itself, but it has to do with getting something as big as it can be. A corporation, it's an organization structured around a particular agenda. So there's a difference between a corporation and a community. Now, there can be community within corporations, no doubt. And I'm not saying that corporations in and of themselves are bad. In fact, that's a pretty logical way to lay out an organization that has a job to do. But when you're talking about a gospel that is so incendiary, something that's about dying to yourself, something that's about picking up your cross and following Jesus, something that's about loving the unlovely, those are not very corporate ideas. Those are fairly radical ideas. And so I think that when we pick and choose certain aspects of who Jesus is and we focus on those, but we neglect the others, we can create a product. And I guess when I say corporate friendly, I'm kind of thinking about the product of Christianity that a lot of modern churches and Christian culture has created, which I think is a very natural result of being in our culture. This is the culture we're in. When in Rome, do as the Romans. So I guess,
right.
We're in a corporate culture, so we think corporately, we think with messaging, we think with branding. Absolutely. If you really look at Jesus, though, I don't think that it's the kind of, it's both very personal and it's very community-driven, but it's not a product that's very corporate-friendly.
No, and I like the way you use the word branding there, because I think of Jesus as being the opposite of branding, really. He just presents himself rather than creating something by which you can then understand him or relate to him. It's directly with himself, isn't it? The kind of thing that comes to mind when you're talking about this, is the televangelist standing up there with the perfect hairstyle and the perfect teeth and saying that you can have a fantastic life if only you have enough faith, and then a congregation of thousands all listening very carefully to everything and watching everything that he does with his perfect suit and all that. Is this the kind of presentation that you have in mind here?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's an easy target, the TV preachers and stuff. And I've got a kind of a hair trigger when it comes to that sort of nonsense. But it becomes far more challenging when I start to think of my own ways that I have allowed a sort of industrialist, commodified methodology to shape not only how I present the gospel to others, but how I actually feel it myself.
Yes.
When I approach God as a product that's designed to scratch my personal itches, satisfy my wants, I am subconsciously, unconsciously inheriting and taking on the tone of the world around me. I just think that mindfulness about that is important, and that's something about renewing our minds, is to allow the Holy Spirit to convict us of those things and to say, okay, this is how I have been perceiving and thinking in this way, and it's time for me to put this corporate thing away and to put this childish, immature, incomplete understanding of Jesus and of the things of God away, and to grow to a new level of understanding. So the TV preachers are kind of an easy target. It's harder when it's me.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's exactly why I threw that at you, because I wanted to make a distinction between those two things so that we can actually see that part of your book is actually challenging us. And so we may not ourselves identify with TV evangelists, but, that's the point. It's that you're actually making a challenge to each one of us in the way that we live our Christian lives. And I was particularly struck when you said on this issue that too many people are giving up on Jesus because of the corporate accent of his people. Mm-hmm. Many find much more satisfying community at the local pub or coffee shop than at church. And of course, this is going to lead us into the things that you're talking about, the coffee and bread and all those sorts of things, and beer, of course. But before we get on to that, I want to ask you a little bit more about your upbringing. You have touched on it, but you say at a certain point that throughout your life, you have, right from when you were a child, you've always viewed everything as spiritual in some sense, so that everything around you is a kind of living parable about God in some way. That could give the impression that, your upbringing was very, very blessed, in the way that the word is often used as, an easy, straightforward, so that you saw everything as this lovely parable. But that's not the case with you, is it? No. You had many difficulties. So do you want to share with us a bit more of those challenges that you had when you were growing up?
Sure. I will say I was blessed by great struggle in the first 10 years, 15 years of my life. My mother, she married the wrong person, and he was a sociopathic, alcoholic criminal. He was a con man who we never knew exactly what he did for a living, but he took people's money, tricked them into giving him money, and then we'd disappear in the middle of the night. Or we would live for several years out in the middle of nowhere, and he would stay gone most of the time and then show up and then disappear again and go do his antics. And so that created a storm cloud over our life of fear that was very real and very reasonable. And there's one of my earlier childhood memories was when my mom finally was scared enough for our safety that about the time I was 6 or 7, she decided it was time to leave, and she left him, and she took my brothers and I and went to live with my grandparents for a little while. And my father actually set out to convince her that he had changed, that he'd quit drinking, that he had turned over, that he got saved, was born again. And so in the process, he actually somehow or another became the pastor of a little storefront church in Springfield, Illinois. And again, this is...
Yeah, that intrigued me. How on earth did he manage to do that?
You know what? I don't know. I was so little. All I know is that we would go to this little storefront church. Now, this was the Jesus movement days, when a lot of churches were popping up in little stores and little, places like that. But I remember him wearing a suit, and I remember him preaching, and it was just like anybody you would have ever seen on TV. Like, he was very, very good at the quivering lips and the sweat and the tears and the drama. He was a very good salesman, and he sold the idea that this was real to him. And you know what? In my old age now, I'm starting to realize that with a mental disease like he had, it could be that was completely real to him. I don't know. But all I do know is that when he convinced her that he had changed and we went back to him, in a short amount of time, the drinking was back, the abuse was back, the terror was back. He could only kind of hold that pastor image together for a short time. And so I remember being very fearful of fraud and mindful of fraud, and I had this sense that he was a fake. Sociopaths have a way of kind of cycling back and forth with their tempers and with their temperaments, and from what I understand, a true sociopath really honestly believes in any given moment whatever it is that he needs to believe in order to be right. And so that was him. And there was times when his pendulum would swing into good dad mode, and he would all of a sudden, do some crazy gesture of niceness, but then it could just as easily swing back the other way and become really frightening. And so that was the first 10 years of my life. When I was 10, my mother finally realized that she needed to get out of that situation. And it was a kind of a miracle that happened that allowed, because he was so connected to bad people, she was always afraid that if she left, he would find her and that would be the end. And
he threatened her with a gun, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. And there's a night that it's also one of those things you kind of wish you could forget, but it was a turning point night because it was when my mom finally realized it was time to go. And he had a big handgun, and he had me on one knee and my brother on the other knee and the baby on the floor, and an exchange student from Japan who was staying with us sitting in the room seeing all this happen. And he was basically telling her that if she ever tried to leave, he would kill her and kill anybody else that got in his way, and he would take us and we'd never see him again. So it wasn't much longer. My mom decided we had to get out, but she kind of needed some help. And if I get the story right, I sent it to her to make sure I told it right. But it was a couple college students in Peoria that came up to her out of nowhere and said, "Man, we've never had this happen, but we were over here praying and we felt like God sent us over and to tell you that we're supposed to help you. And we don't know what that means. And we don't even know what we're offering to do. But, this is the first time we've ever felt God tell us anything," something like that. And she told these kids what was going on. And one of them, they made some calls, and some uncle or dad or somebody showed up a couple days later with a pickup truck when my father was supposed to be in court, packed up as much as we could, and we disappeared. And we went to live at a rescue mission for a while in Aurora, Illinois. And then eventually the police assured my mom that it was safe to come out of hiding. But we lived in hiding for several months and then moved in with my grandparents. And eventually my parents were divorced. And then my mother met a great man through an Episcopal or Anglican kind of renewal ministry, and they started thinking about getting married. And on my 13th birthday, when my biological father called to talk to me for my birthday, that was the last time I ever talked to him. I had been encouraged by counselors to just let every thought and anger fly. I kind of went through this sort of primal scream, venting. And when he found out that day that she was thinking about getting married, he lost it on the phone and threatened it. All the same threats of violence again. And this time there were witnesses. And so that was the last time we heard from him. He disappeared. He ended up traveling around the world doing different scams, and eventually died in a hotel in Switzerland when I was 23, and probably drank himself to death and certainly lived a very unhealthy life. So his life was a tragedy, and it sent me seeking authenticity. I realized later on it was just Christian Sunday school answers were never enough for me. I needed to know that something was true. I needed to experience it. I needed to dig deeper. I fortunately was blessed with a chorus of mentors and family members that surrounded me and were just great. So that's why I see people who have grown up with far less tribulation in their life, but I feel blessed. In the final analysis, I wouldn't change anything.
So you feel blessed now looking back over it, but of course at the time you didn't. I mean, there was what you say that you actually tried to stop believing in God during those difficult times, but you say you couldn't do that.
It never took. I mean, it would last 15 minutes once, or maybe overnight once, and then the morning would come. And no, the presence of God just always felt everywhere to me. And that was very frustrating, because during those really scary times, it was like, why aren't you fixing this? Why aren't you, if you're God and you're good and you can do all this crazy stuff it says in the Bible that you did, then why can't you just take this guy out? Why can't you fix him? Why can't you?
So why didn't that lead you towards agnosticism or even atheism?
I wish I could explain it. I remember several times, especially when we lived on this farm before we went into hiding and before that thing. I remember my grandfather telling me once, you can yell at God, he can take it. So one time when I was just feeling like my head might explode, I was so angry, so fearful, I went out. We had a couple 100 acres of kind of wild land that we were living on, and I went to the farthest away point of that land that I could, and I just screamed until I had no voice. I pounded the ground and I wept, and I really tried to break up with God at that point, to say, like, you can't be real. Like, you can't be a good God and be letting us go through this. But as soon as I got it all out, it was just like my grandpa said. I just felt this sense come over me that it was going to be, that he was there and that it was wrong what was going on. That was important. It was like, it wasn't the sense that, no, that everything's fine, just hang in there. It was, no, this is wrong. Something's wrong with the whole world. I wasn't old enough to articulate it, and I just tried, and I always felt, as soon as I put my head on the pillow, I felt this presence of God saying, I'm with you, I will always be with you, trust me. And music became the language that I could start to process that through, first by listening to other people's music, well, still that, but also then eventually creating my own music. And something about the emotional connection, the spiritual connection of music was the bridge that I found to kind of keep me tethered to something. But yeah, I tried and it just never worked.
Obviously, it makes sense that you would see music in a spiritual way, because as you said yourself, you've always seen everything in a way, in a spiritual sense. Can you explain what you mean by that?
It's tough to analyze your own biases, and I'm not sure where this came from other than the fact that in addition to this terrible biological father, like I said, I've always had so many other great family members that have been so spiritually wise and loving and compassionate. But from a very young age, the clouds in the sky to me spoke of God's creativity. The pain that I felt when I hurt my ankle or cut my hand told me about something spiritual. The food that we were eating told me about something spiritual. Weeding in the garden with my grandpa told me about something spiritual. Everything to me reinforced a couple of prime ideas, that there is a God, that I'm not him, and that if those two things are true, then it makes sense to try and spend my life seeking out who that God is and trying to align my life to be in cooperation with God as opposed to being at odds with God, because I saw a certain sense to that.
So these are, as you say, kind of little parables about the biblical God. I mean, when people often talk about, they see nature as being spiritual in some way, they're often talking in a kind of, pantheistic way, but you don't mean that, do you?
Oh, no. To me, it's very personal. I've never encountered anything that goes against a certain God logic. That God logic is actually very inverted when set up against human logic sometimes. The idea that our instincts as humans is to preserve ourselves and to provide for ourselves and to protect ourselves, whereas this God logic is to preserve others and to protect others and to provide for others and somehow then have our needs met by others as well. I've always found that to be true, and it's not that I've always lived in perfect harmony with that. I'm not some, master of it, but I've always sensed it. And to me, the question was always not whether something was Christian or secular or Christian or non-Christian, but was it good? Was it true? Was it beautiful? Maybe this is a result of reading Francis Schaeffer books when I was too young to understand them, or something like that.
Yes, I can certainly hear echoes of that. Yes, indeed.
I read a lot of books that I did not understand, but I was convinced that there was truth to be found in them. My mom gave me a book when I was really young called "The Practice of the Presence of God" by Brother Lawrence, and God, I can't even remember. I might have been 11 or 12 years old, and it was over my head in terms of the writing style for sure. But I always liked to throw myself into conversations with grown-ups. When I couldn't quite keep up, it felt like a good way to learn things. And that book, the idea of sensing God's presence when washing dishes and things, that was very formative. Surprised by Joy and Mere Christianity and some things by C.S. Lewis, that definitely spoke into it. But it seemed like those things all came even after. As a kid, I heard things, and I would always listen to say, is this thing telling me the truth, or is it telling me a lie? Is it pointing me to myself, or is it pointing me to something bigger and cooler than myself? So it's just kind of always the way I've interacted with stuff. Sometimes it drives my kids crazy because I can turn anything into an object lesson, and they kind of start rolling their eyes like, "Oh, Dad, can you just watch the movie?"
Yeah, I can somehow imagine that. Yes, yeah. That idea of practicing the presence of God. I mean, I encountered that, I think, through Francis Schaeffer. So presumably he was relaying those ideas, and I've always found that very powerful. Actually, you can choose. You can sort of catch yourself having a kind of slumbering attitude towards your faith, and actually choose in a moment to say, no, just a minute, God is here with me, and encounter God by an act of the will. And I've always found that very powerful. Now, when you were, I think it was when you were, is it a teenager or perhaps in your early 20s, you said the Jesus People, and you mentioned a Cornerstone Festival, and this had quite an impact upon you. Do you want to tell us something about that?
Sure, yeah. Actually, I was 13 or so when I first heard about Jesus People through a band called Resurrection Band, or later Res Band, that came from that community. And Jesus People was a community that had started in the early 70s with a bunch of these Jesus hippie people like my mom had kind of been when I was a kid. But they all lived together and shared everything in common and spent their life serving others. And it just absolutely rocked me. And the music of Glenn Kaiser and Resurrection Band was hugely influential, because not only was it rock and very edgy rock and pretty raw, and I could relate to the tension and the pain and the reality of their music more than most Christian music, because it lined up more with my experience of life. but I also, there was a spiritual intensity to it. There was a biblical literacy to it. There was a cultural engagement to it. Every song was focused. Every song was purposeful. Nothing was just a jam. There was multiple layers of meaning in most of the songs. And I, as a young kid, I think I first heard them on a Christian radio station in Chicago when I was not quite 13. One night I was listening to the radio and this kind of safe Christian music that I honestly didn't like that much. But I was listening to secular or, whatever, mainstream music, and my mom and some other people were kind of challenging me like, how is that glorifying God? How does that line up with this life that you're living and that's so, Jesus focused? And I said, I don't know. A lot of this music just feels very real and true. I knew that most of the mature Christians in my life liked this adult contemporary Christian music stuff. And so I thought, well, maybe the problem is I'm not a mature enough Christian. So kind of like the way that I did in Conversations, I just sort of said, well, I'm just going to listen to this music until I start to like it. And I tried that, and I listened for several months, and I'd be working on making a model car, I'd be painting pictures, whatever, and I'd have headphones on listening to this Christian radio station and never really loving the music. But I thought,
yeah, I can definitely see eye to eye with that one. Too many of these sort of worship songs and things are like "Jesus is my boyfriend" kind of lyrics, and very, very soft sort of pop soul-y kind of sound, and it just gets wearisome after a while.
Well,
I find actually a lot of secular classic pieces, classic groups, things like the Police or REM and stuff like that, and I find that actually quite spiritual listening to that.
Yeah.
Presumably, you connect with that kind of thought.
Yeah. I mean, I was just at Bonnaroo last week, which is a big festival here in Tennessee, and I got to see Tears for Fears for the first time, and I've loved their music for a long time, but here I am with this tent full of half-stoned, crazy, mostly young people who were not born when that band was putting out their first records. But I'm listening to lyrics, and Change, the song You Can Change, and they have Everybody Wants to Rule the World, and like all these songs are saying so much truth. And it's just because it's not specifically Christian doesn't mean it's not good and true. And so I was at that point when I was 12 or 13, I was listening to music that was stuff like the Talking Heads or, like you said, the Police or the Clash. I really liked the Clash. And so when I listened to Christian music, it was just not aesthetically my kind of music. Later on in life, I've gone back and I've re-listened to some of that stuff, and I can actually appreciate more of it now. But back then, I was 13 or almost 13, and I just needed something that sounded a little crazy because that's how the world felt to me. Yeah. Well, anyway, one night in the middle of this, radio station decided to launch a rock and alternative show, and I happened to be listening when they played the first few songs, and it just blew my mind. And one of the first 4 bands that they played was Resurrection Band. And I heard a song called Stark Spare that was all about poverty in the inner city, and that Jesus was there in the midst of that poverty, that Jesus was walking amongst those people on the broken glass and in the damaged streets and in the fear. And that song, and I was like, I've got to hear more of this. And so I went and found an album of theirs, and then there was songs about divorce and songs about a disabled Vietnam veteran coming back from war and being rejected by people. There were songs about addiction, and I just thought, oh my gosh, now this is exciting. And so I went and saw them play a concert, and they announced, the concert was incredible, and there was another band called the 77s, which was a very different way of doing Christian thinking rock music, but it was also very, very cool. And at that concert, they announced that that Res Band was going to be starting a festival the following summer in 1984. And I just knew I have to get at that festival. And a funny story is that here I am. I was then not quite 14, and I was dying to go to the first Cornerstone Festival, but I couldn't find anybody to take me. And the Christian radio station did a contest, and they had Res Band in the studio. They were doing an interview with them on the air talking about this festival, and I was so excited I could hardly contain myself. And they said, "Hey, we're going to do a Res Band trivia contest. So if you know and love Res Band, you got to get on the phone. We're going to do a trivia contest, and the winner gets a free ticket to the Cornerstone Festival." So I called in, and I was the first caller, and they got on there, and I said, "Okay, here's the question." They said, "How many times has Res Band used a snoring sound on one of their songs?" And I said, "I know this. And I think I said, I might have to, I might be wrong right now, but I think I said the answer was 4. And Glenn Kaiser was like, "Oh, sorry, kid, the answer is 3." I said, "No, it's not. No, it's not. It's 4." And he was like, "What?" And I told him the 4. And there was one that they did that was backwards, that they put a snore, but they flew it in backwards. And he was like,
"You're a real
son of a
expert."
gun, the kid's right. So I won a ticket to the first Cornerstone Festival by beating Glenn Kaiser at Resurrection Band Trivia. And that is something that not very many other people can say.
Oh, wow.
But I did go and visit the community. I saw what they did, and I really identified with it. I've met many people that lived there, some for a short time, some for a long time. 5 years later, I started my company, True Tunes, at one of the Cornerstone Festivals. Glenn Kaiser's become and been a close friend and a really good mentor of mine ever since, and still is to this day. And in fact, I did a tour stop on my book tour in Chicago at their coffee house. They have one of the best coffee shops in Chicago now. And so even though the Cornerstone Festival's gone, they're still continuing to do a lot of great stuff with people who are, it's a difficult thing to do, and it's a very risky thing to do, and it's certainly not without its kind of complications. But Glenn has been a huge supporter and mentor of mine all the way along.
You mentioned coffee there, and that obviously has a very important place in your life. You make quite a lot of it in the book, and yet you call it Jesus Bread and Chocolate. Perhaps you should have called it Jesus Bread and Chocolate and Coffee.
Well, I'll tell you the honest truth. The working title for this book for 2 years was Bread, Coffee, Chocolate, Beer, Music, and Jesus. That's just too many things. They said, these days people have to remember the title so that they can go on Amazon and look it up. And so through a lot of back and forth, we came up with Jesus Bread and Chocolate. But there's a lot more to it than those.
Yeah, and as I said before the interview, I'm afraid I was rather embarrassing how to admit to drinking not a very good quality coffee, I'm afraid, by your standards, but it's pepped me up slightly. You say at some point in the book that you were drinking a coffee and you said, this means something, and I like the way that you linked that to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where Roy Neary, of course played by Richard Dreyfuss, lovingly forks this mashed potato into this sort of weird mountain shape, and he says, this means something. It was one of my favourite films, so I just loved the way you put that in. Well, what does it mean to say coffee means something?
Well, I think I apply that kind of Roy Neary mentality to everything in this book.
Fantastic.
Everything means something, So when it comes to the coffee in particular, I tell a story of my first cup of coffee being, in the midst of a pretty emotionally turbulent time of my life. I had just fallen in love with this girl. We'd been best friends for a long time, and I had gone to St. Louis to talk to her father about us getting married, and I'd kind of blown the whole thing, and he didn't like me at all, and it wasn't going very well. And I had to leave her there in St. Louis, and I had to go back up to Chicago, and I was driving on my way, and I hadn't ever had coffee at this point in my life. I'd kind of avoided it. Plus, I had a lot of health problems when I was younger, and I wasn't allowed to have coffee. But at this point, I was allowed to have it. I just hadn't really developed a taste for it. And I was on my way back to Chicago, and I got pulled over for speeding, which was just terrible because I always kind of painted myself as this good kid. I think it's the oldest child syndrome and whatever else. But I got pulled over for speeding and just felt devastated, and I stopped at a rest stop to kind of calm down and also let the storm blow through. There was a vending machine of coffee in this, this kind of roadside thing, and so I thought, okay, I'm just going to go for it. And my first cup of coffee came out of this vending machine on the side of Interstate 55, and it was absolutely horrendous. And
I won't be so embarrassed about my cup of coffee after all, actually.
Oh, yeah, you shouldn't. And this was probably, the worst coffee ever. But I was determined to learn how to like coffee, because I just decided that was going to be a part of my life, and the irony or the humor of it is that in a relatively really short amount of time, I went from lots of cream and sugar and bad coffee to buying specialty beans and grinding my own beans at home, which back then was still kind of, not everybody really did that. Most people bought coffee in really big cans and scooped brown powder into their machine, and out came brown liquid. And, it was more about the caffeine and less about the flavor. It actually sometimes was more about the smell. It would smell good when you made it, but it didn't really taste good. So I got very into specialty coffee pretty early, just within a couple months of that first cup of terrible coffee. So what does that mean? For me, it has become another example, another proof that if we take a little bit more time with something, if we become a little bit more thoughtful about it, we put a little bit more effort into it, if we're willing to invest a little bit more money, but in actuality, sometimes you can save money doing better coffee, but just it's more about the effort and the time and the thoughtfulness, a little bit of skill, not brain surgery kind of skill, just a little bit of skill. You can make really, really good coffee. In fact, you can make coffee that even if you think you need to have cream and sugar in your coffee, you can make coffee the right way. And a lot of people will try our coffee and say, wow, this doesn't need anything in it. I can actually drink this black. This tastes really good. It's not bitter. It's not,
Okay, so that means something with regard to coffee itself, but obviously you mean something parabolic about this. I mean, did this thought occur to you when you were on mission in Honduras? Because there's obviously you had a great experience there where you were experiencing fellowship with these people who were running a mission, and you had this. Would you say that the coffee was great? But it wasn't just that the coffee was great; it was the mingling of that with this subjective experience of the fellowship. Was that when you had this sense of this coffee means something?
I think even before then, I started to realize that sitting around having a cup of coffee was the way my friends liked to spend time when we weren't doing something else. Just going somewhere and having a cup of coffee was an excuse to sit and talk for a while. So I saw the spiritual significance of that. But then I started to realize that if I wanted to have somebody over to my space and serve them coffee, I wanted to really make that coffee the best coffee they'd ever had, because it was a part of this hospitality instinct. I wanted to honor them, and I wanted them to feel special and important and valued. And honestly, I also will admit that some of it is I wanted them to be impressed. I wanted someone to think I was cool. I'm not perfect by any stretch. There's a little bit of vanity in there too. But yes, that one trip, I'd spent a month with the missions group called the Evangelical Alliance Mission. It was just myself and one other guy traveling through Mexico, Colombia, and Honduras to capture stories of what their missionaries were doing, both on film and in video and in written word. The first stop was Mexico, and I tell a story in there about being in the Mexican desert down in the southern tip of the Baja Peninsula, somewhere between La Paz and Constitucion, a little tiny town, but you have to put the word town in quotes because there was certainly nothing resembling a town there, called San Hilario. And we stopped there and met some people who had just put a cement slab in the middle of the desert, and that was their church building. Wow. And they were so excited about this. And so I was moved by their passion for community and the fact that that cement slab meant so much to them. But before, they wouldn't let us leave without serving us some coffee. So I tell the story in more detail in the book, but that coffee was just overwhelming moment for me. I mean, and somewhere I wish I could. I have to find this picture. I took a picture of these two little dainty porcelain cups. I have no idea how they survived out in the desert like that, but they had these two beautiful little porcelain cups that they set out, and they poured this coffee, and we drank this coffee, and it was so good. And I realized that I don't even remember if the coffee flavor and texture and mouthfeel and if the beans were properly roasted. All I knew was that moment was one of the most meaningful moments of that trip. And then a couple weeks later, when we were in Honduras, we were in an actual rainforest, and our host was showing us some of his coffee trees. So I got to, and I didn't even know that that's what they were at first, but I got to see what a coffee tree looked like, and he pulled one of the cherries off the tree and rubbed the fruit off of it and showed me what the coffee bean looks like when it's fresh and brand new and kind of white and waxy looking and pale greenish, kind of swollen and weird. I never would have identified it as coffee until he told me. And I pocketed a few of those, as a reminder. And I thought, boy, there's a lot here. This coffee seed it's a seed of a fruit. It grows only in certain areas and shady areas that are difficult to get to. What does that tell me about the gospel? What does that tell me about spiritual formation? This bean then has to be dried. It has to be dried in certain conditions or it'll spoil and rot. Once it's dried, it can be stored for a long, long time. But once you're ready to use it, you have to roast it. You can't just use it green. It won't do anything. It tastes terrible. And but once you roast it, you got just a certain amount of time. You do it too long, then you bake it or you burn it. You do it too short, and it's kind of grassy tasting. But there's just this right spot where if you roast it just right, it creates this chemical reaction in the bean called the Maillard reaction. That it's like when you make toast, it changes the chemistry of the bean, and all of a sudden this thing completely changes. And now if you grind it up to just the right particle size and put it through water that's just the right temperature, something incredible happens. And I thought all kinds of stuff. I thought, who was the first person that figured this out? How many people did it take? How many errors did it take to figure this out? Coffee and chocolate and all these things that God really put here for us to discover. But then he let us do the job of discovering it. He didn't send a prophet down to tell us how to do it. And then all those particulars have to be just right. And I thought, man, how often do I approach my faith, my life with God, my journey, with that kind of intentionality? And how often would I rather just go into a vending machine and hit a button and put a couple quarters in? So all of that definitely echoed a certain level of discipline that I felt I really wanted to enhance in my life. And it also made me just a better coffee brewer. I got excited about coffee. And I think that told me something. There's people that go, I don't like coffee. And I think, well, some people just don't. But a lot of people who don't like coffee have never tried good coffee. And what they're rejecting is something that's really not coffee at its ideal. And, oh, man, that just makes me think of so many people that say, no, I can't do the Christianity thing. Somebody, I don't remember if it was Muggeridge or Chesterton, that said, tell me about the God you don't believe in, because there's a good chance I don't believe in that God either. I don't remember who said that, but that is another quote that bangs around in my head from when I was a kid. And I feel like, boy, how many people have rejected coffee because they just never had it prepared right? How many people have rejected the gospel because they just never have had it prepared right?
Yeah, the coffee that we have so often is really, really heavily commodified, and it's this, as I said, you'd probably be embarrassed by the kind of coffee that I tend to drink, and very much in the same way our Christian lives are very heavily commodified. We approach that life in such an easy way. It's just sort of there. We go to church and we just do the churchy things, and everything feels easy and the same every time we arrive there, and we don't spend quality time actually getting the most out of our relationship with God and transmitting that relationship to other people. This seems to be what you're getting at with this analogy, really, of coffee.
Yeah, and I chose some of those principles apply across the whole book to everything that I'm talking about, but others I tried to identify different underlying values with each of those things that were kind of unique. So with coffee, I talk a lot about value, and the fact that our concept of value is distorted by the corporate model and the commodification process. Even the coffee beans themselves, when they're a commodity, then they're basically valued at whatever coffee around the world is valued at. There's no motivation for a planter, a farmer, to invest more in better technologies or to treat his employees better, to offer healthcare, education, because he's only going to get the same price whether he spends more on his coffee or not. And these people I've seen firsthand are living just barely out of the poverty level, if that. That, to me, tells me about value and how we assign value to things, and what things we think we can't afford. Boy, we miss it. Chocolate, I talk about discernment, and I identify the beer with discretion and discernment. So each of those things is connected to another, but they each could also connect to all of them at the same time. So.
Yeah, with the chocolate one, that seems to be more to do with the very essence of our faith, the true, authentic center of our faith, just as you were saying about, the true, authentic cocoa center, which has tended to be obscured by all the sugar and the fat and stuff that's thrown at it. Yeah. And you make some interesting comments there about how the very process of industrialization, of course, connected, you make a connection there to the Enlightenment project of things getting better and better. And you also bring in the notion of postmodernism as well there by linking it to the idea of, we've got chocolate's no good these days, so let's just say it's all a load of rubbish. Let's just, make up our reality for ourselves kind of thing. Yeah. And you seem to be driving towards the notion of saying, no, actually, there is a core to this that we need to return to. And to buy your analogy, this is the true cocoa center of this, and if we could recover that core and treat it lovingly and in an artisanal manner, to use your word, then we will find something that we've lost. It's not to just say everything's the same, let's just chuck it out, but no, there is something we've lost and we need to recover it, and that is the heart and the center of the gospel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's I'm glad to hear that that's what you saw in that, because that's where my heart is with really most of the different aspects of this. But with the chocolate thing, it really jumped out at me. There's so many things, and some of them I elaborate on, but I really intentionally decided to leave some things out there to allow the reader to connect the dots in a way that made sense to them. I didn't feel the need to spoon feed every single metaphor.
No, yes, exactly. You're painting with a very broad brush, but I think that's a good thing because, yes, as you say, it allows people to fill in the holes for themselves.
I had there's a section in there I talk about just the mystery to me of the fact that cocoa or cacao pods, they're these long, weird things, and then inside there's these seeds, but the seeds are held in this slimy kind of muck. And who in the world, in the ancient world, would have seen that thing and said, "Oh, let's experiment with this because it smells really bad." And then you find out, well, if they were to just take the seeds out, clean them up, and try and do something with them, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't taste good. It wouldn't be good. It would taste like aspirin. It would be terrible. But if you let those seeds sit in that mucilage, that kind of slime, it turns out that slime has just the right kind of sugar in it, and there's natural yeast in the air that will find that sugar and eat it and ferment the sugars, and it creates just enough warmth to create this chemical reaction in the fermenting process for the cacao beans to actually change. They're not the same thing once they've been fermented. But the process isn't over. Now you take those things and you have to roast them at a certain temperature. Then you have to extrude the essence out of it, and then you have this base material that you can start to experiment with. And boy, I've had people that have read it, or people when I've done speaking engagements, that they can identify with all different points of that process and pull their own spiritual metaphor that relates to them. So I try to, sometimes when I'm talking about the history of coffee or the history of chocolate or the history of bread or the history of beer, I'm making some obvious points, but I'm also laying some things out there that I've discovered because those things created some kind of moment of resonance in my own mind that got me excited, and I'm hoping that other people will find that same sense of discovery, as opposed to me pointing to every star in the sky and saying, here's how you should look at this constellation, and here's how I'm trying to let people find some of their own, but some of them I just couldn't resist.
Okay, so one of the things which I connected with, or you're inviting us to make these connections with our own lives, is talking about beer, and you say that's an illustration of cultivating taste. Is that right? I think you talk about that in connection with beer and cultivating spiritual taste as well, and that spoke to me. I was thinking of on an aesthetic level as well, how one cultivates the aesthetic in our lives. You learn to enjoy things, works of art or works of music or whatever it might be, or just looking at the scenery outside. It's not necessarily something that is just natural to us, is it? It may start off as just the beginnings of something natural, and then we work on it until you actually realize that this is actually something really worth developing in your life. And you say this of spiritual matters as well. How does that connect to beer?
Well, I mean, a couple levels. One is, for a while, America was known around the world as the source of the worst beer in the world. And
right.
So there's a little bit of a story I unpack of how that happened, with Prohibition and the wars, that kind of thing. But it's interesting that American light lager became the universal American beer. For a lot of people, that was really the only beer they ever experienced. And it was this very watery, almost flavorless beer that you would want to serve really, really cold, because the colder it was, the less you could taste it. And
so would this be something like Budweiser?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Horrible.
Just bad stuff. But, it came to define, they called themselves the king of beers, for crying out loud. Now, what Budweiser did do, which is the same thing as Starbucks and other major brands, they did a lot to automate things, to create consistency. I could very easily draw a bunch of positive analogies as well, but when it comes to the taste and the flavor, you can see that the more flavor you actually take out of a thing, you can tend to actually increase its marketability to a widest possible number of people. So the more bland something is, the more wide appeal it has. And it's all about marketing at that point. So, in America, there's all these people that are either Bud-like people or Miller-like people or Coors-like people. And there's a great film I saw that showed that out of 100 people, or that most people, even if they said they were avid, they were positive that they liked Bud Light more than Miller Lite or whatever, couldn't tell the difference in a blind taste test. That's all about marketing. It's really not about what they're actually tasting. So that tells me something about our taste, that we really have to cultivate our taste, that we're so subjective when it comes to how we taste things, whether those are ideas or flavors. We just have this very subjective way of tasting things. And so we need coaches. I've needed friends to kind of help me learn how to taste things better. It might seem strange or like, well, then it's not really your taste, but that's not true. Coaches and mentors can help us notice things that were there all the time that we just never picked up on. Yes. And so with beer, as a brewer myself, I've made lots of different kinds of beer, and I know how little changes of the ingredients can change things in the flavor. And someone can just drink one really, really cold and drink it fast, and they don't even know. But if they really learn how to taste it, there's this movement in America of craft brewers that are increasingly popular, and it's still a minority of the beer sales, but it's year over year, it's always increasing 20, 50% year over year. People saying, you know what, I can do better than Bud Light. I can do better than this flavorless kind of thing. So that I kind of use that as a parallel because I feel the same way about institutionalized Christianity and commodified Christianity. Like I need to cultivate my taste so that I can discern the good from the bad. And that isn't going to be I have to humble myself sometime and go to somebody and say, you know what, you taste this better than I do. Help me learn how to taste like you taste. And so I've had people do that for me, and that's a little bit of what I'm trying to start the process of with this book, is to help some people learn how to taste things a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, going back to beer, I've been kind of coached in the ales here in the UK. Because, I didn't really like beer, actually, for a very long time. But now we've been living in this area of Lancashire. There's a really good pub just around the corner. And, in fact, rereading your book in preparation for this interview yesterday persuaded me to go back and have another beer yesterday. So
there you go.
But what they do is they have three, and each week they have a different selection of three. So I suppose over the few years that we've been here, I've been having one week and having one another week, and I've really come to enjoy beer, actually. These ales that are on offer. Not all of them, of course, but it's kind of coached me just by taking an interest in what's going on locally. But before that, the kind of thing you've been talking about, the mass-produced beers, they just did nothing for me. And I suppose, going along with your analogy, there must be a lot of people who see the kind of Christianity that's often presented, which just looks all the same.
Right.
It must be a great put-off to people.
To some people. Some people really love that. That they want to be a part of a really big team. They want to not have to think about it. They just want to say, all the TV shows in America is always funny, or even movies. How many times have you seen a character just go up to a bar and say, I'll have a beer? I've never seen anybody do that in real life. Everybody always says what kind of beer they want, but in Hollywood, it's always just give me a beer. And the bartender somehow knows what he wants. And I think, you know what, there's a lot of Christians that are they're tired, they're so engaged in the rat race that maybe when it comes time for church, for teaching, they're just like, just give me a sermon. I don't care. Just give me something and make it go down easy. Let's have it done pretty quick. And we feel a little bit refreshed, and then we'll move on. And
exactly, and move on. So don't necessarily get to know anybody who's sitting next to you or anything like that. So I've often found that large churches just don't really do anything for me. I find that our local community here, where you just have, we have about 90 people tend to turn up on a Sunday, and I suppose, I don't know how many people I exactly know, but we have a house group that has 9 people in it. And I find that kind of intimate setting absolutely great for getting to know each other and be able to share our lives in Christ. But looking at some of these mega churches, or even just some of the the more modest churches here in the UK, which don't compare very often with these mega churches that you have there in the US, even so, I think there's just too many people. I had an experience with, I won't say which city it was, but a community church here in the UK. This is 20 years ago or so, and I went to visit a friend there, and I was sort of staying there for a few weeks, and I was sort of popped into this social situation. I remember just somebody saying to me, "Oh, hello, you're so and so. Yeah, I've heard about you. Go and mingle, feel free to mingle." I just was lost in this total crowd. So that attention to individual, intimate relationships, I can very much connect with.
Oh, good. I think that, for me, it's been about balance. I do think, in fact, I know a big church that some friends are involved with in Birmingham, Alabama here. I found out that something like 75-80% of the people in this huge church are involved in some kind of home group. That's an incredible percentage. And I would love it if our little church in Chicago had that kind of participation in home groups. So some big churches get it, and they really work on that. And there's also some things that big churches can do in terms of changing policies at a city level, or, getting involved with civics and things like that are great. Or, a big church can take one offering like this church does and give it to small urban disadvantaged churches and change their whole budget for the year. So I don't take anything away from that. It's just that when we mindlessly get caught up in this pursuit of the big and the impressive, it's the mindlessness of it that I think is the problem. If someone knows what they're doing and they're thoughtful about it, they can find a way to cultivate real community with a small number of people within a larger context. Other people will choose to do it on a small context. And I think it's not a one-size-fits-all. Everybody should be in a home church thing, or everybody should. And that's, again, even our urge to find one-size-fits-all is a part of our product-driven, sort of.
Yeah, I take your point, yeah. You're very much down on the idea of church growth, aren't you? At least in the way it's presented, as if growth is the be-all and end-all.
Yeah, I think that if growth is your goal, you're going to take steroids to get there, and you're going to get very unhealthy. I think that growth as a natural effect of healthy life is fine. It's just the question of, is growth really for its own sake, or is growth a natural byproduct of health? And sometimes we need to be able to say, if we grow any bigger, this part of what we're doing will no longer be possible. So how are we going to either change, split off into smaller things, or slow this growth? And that's really difficult.
It's really necessary for big churches to do that, isn't it? Because you say in the book, I think you say there are sociological studies that say that people can only cope with 150 relationships, something like that. So the idea of even beginning to try to relate to 4,000 people is just impossible, really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what happens is, by necessity, the more relationships you have, the shallower they must become.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's that simple.
I'd like to end by asking you about this theology of food that you talk about with respect to some people who called Bill and Cherie Guerrant. Have I got that name correct?
Yeah, close enough, Guerrant.
Yeah, because it's Bill, you say, who studied Wesleyan theology, and he has applied his understanding of theology there to the very business of growing organic food in a very serious way. So I'm intrigued by this, because obviously that's the opposite of sort of the corporate production of food that we're so dominated by these days, and it's interesting to see that from a theological point of view. So could you tell us what they do and how they see that as connecting with theology?
Well, yeah, and I think that when his book is done, I'll be one of the first to read that, and I'll be able to sound a lot more intelligent when it comes to specifically Wesley's take on this. And Bill, I met him at a festival, and we were both sitting on a panel talking about food justice issues. He is a farmer from Virginia, but he walked away from a law practice to go back to a piece of land that had been in his family for a long time, that had been sort of corporate farmed and kind of stripped of a lot of its value. Something moved him to leave his successful law practice and go back to this broken down farm and bring it back to life. And when I heard that, I said, man, we have to get lunch. We got to hang out. And we ended up spending the whole rest of that day just walking around and talking. And we found this real symmetry in the way we were thinking. And I told him about my ideas for this book, and he told me about his thesis he was working on. And he really did take it to another level in terms of connecting the theology of redemption and healing and reconciliation and more, and connecting that directly to farming. He's much more aware of the sort of corporate farming problems. There's a lot of good documentaries that I've watched since then. He recommended a few. What we have done to farming is about as far removed from anything it seems God intended as it could be. And it's turned the very process of putting a seed into dirt and it growing and having a harvest, something very, very biblical, something that Jesus referenced all the time. But it's turned it into a laboratory that's, just getting incredible yields and genetic modification, and it's affecting the earth, it's affecting the air, it's affecting the bees and all this stuff. And so there was a million ways that I could relate to that. I already had a chapter in my outline because I grew up, my grandfather had a garden in his backyard, and I was always involved with that, and I've always dabbled with it myself a little bit. But when I met Bill, I thought, okay, this guy, he's at the deeper end of this pool, and I'm going to hang out with him and kind of learn some. So he's been a great source for that. But he felt that when he looked back at some of the teachings of Wesley and other reformers, he was able to see things that he could connect to the modern food movement, which was this effort to extricate food and farming from the clutches of industrialism and the commodification process, as it were.
And no doubt they will be looking back to, obviously, biblical theology. So I'm thinking of the good stewardship, which is talked about, of course, in Genesis. And it's not really a picture there we have of exploitation at all. It is stewardship. And, of course, it's the exploitation that we see going on today that we really have to find ways of avoiding and working against. And I'd certainly be fascinated to read that as well. Do you think it's actually going to be published as a book?
Yes, it will. And if anybody wants to be updated on that, if you follow my blog, subscribe to my newsletter, as soon as that book is available, I will definitely be letting everybody know about it. So, and if you follow me on Twitter, any of that kind of stuff, I'll make sure people find out about it. I'm not sure what the time frame is, but I don't think it's going to be too far off in the future. Yeah, I mean, from reaping what you sow to the parable of the sower, the seeds falling on good soil and bad soil. The gospel is an agricultural story, and we've just lost some. It's like we're reaping what we sow, for sure. We're reaping a harvest of chemical holocaust right now, and that's because those are the seeds that we're planting.
Yeah, and even if we feel that we're not involved in doing that ourselves, in a sense, we're allowing these things to happen by our complacency. So we are involved in this.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. You mentioned your website there and following you. So could you give out your website and perhaps your Twitter account as well? Sure,
yeah. If you go to JesusBreadChocolate.com, that's the easy one to remember. That'll get you there. I call my blog 33 1/3. And the idea is that that's how fast a record spins, but there's something about putting a vinyl record on and slowing down and listening to vinyl that I still love. But there's a metaphor there, too, that you take time, you get the record out of the package, you put it on, you drop the needle, you sit back. You're not doing it while you're driving around and stuff. So 33 1/3.net, but JesusBreadChocolate.com or JohnJThompson.com will get you to the same place. Yeah. And I'm on Twitter at John J. Thompson. And also Facebook.com/JesusBreadChocolate. So it's weird how we've got all these tools to do this quote unquote social media, and yet it's harder to connect with people than ever before.
Yeah, I sort of know what you mean. Yeah. And is that the best way to get hold of your book, through your website?
You certainly can. If it's an international order, it's available through Amazon. I know in the UK and in Australia and in Canada. In the US, I can definitely send copies. I've made some fun little extras too. So if you can find links.
You sign copies?
Yeah, I sign copies, and that's through my site. So that's Jesus Bread Chocolate, and I ship them right out of my house. And sometimes I have one. You can buy a little bit of coffee that I roasted at my house if you want to. And I have one customer had bought once a week. She would place an order for another pound of coffee. And I thought, well, this isn't really what I did it kind of as an add-on, but she just wanted coffee. So I was selling her coffee. And I thought it's kind of funny until after about the fifth order, she finally ordered the book. And I thought that was not really the way I expected it to go. But hey, it's kind of fun.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't get that because, of course, I had an electronic copy sent to me, but there we go. Well, I really much enjoyed speaking to you, and I enjoyed the book. As I said, I do recommend it. It has received many favourable reviews on Amazon. I noticed, actually, that, and I think this was unfair, a few of the reviews said that something like, the book doesn't teach you loads and loads of things, but as I said, I do think that's unfair, and I was thinking about how to respond to that, and I'd like to do it this way. There's a philosopher called Isaiah Berlin, and he has this description of the fox and the hedgehog, and the fox knows lots and lots of things quite well, but the hedgehog knows one big thing really well. And I think that your book's a bit like that. It has a major message to get over, but you know that and you feel that message very intensely, and it gets that over by revisiting that insight over and over through different people, different situations, to help us kind of meditate on that. And I think that's important. I think it's an important message, and I think we do need to take that very seriously. If we're going to present the authentic, true aroma or flavour of Christ, as you say in the book, to the world around us that really does need to know him. So thank you, John, for coming on. It has been a great pleasure to chat with you, and I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. It's been an honor. I've been enjoying your show, and I'm honored to be in the company of the smart people you talk to.
It's very generous of you. Thanks ever so much for coming on.
Thank you.